There are two shows on TV that my wife and I really, really love. And some of you guys might know these shows. Two shows. The first show is The X Factor. How many of you guys like The X Factor? Wow, just one, two. Okay, 3 of us, 4 of us, 5 of us. All right, right. The X Factor, it's a singing competition where aspiring pop stars, sing and compete for a $5 million contract. Recording contract, and my wife and I love the show. We're particular fans of the leopard-faced girl. We think that she's going to go home next week, but whatever, we're praying for her. Also, the second show my wife and I like is a show called Shark Tank. How many of you guys know Shark Tank? All right, this show's a little crazier, right? This show features a panel of business executives called sharks who consider offers from entrepreneurs seeking investments for their business or product. And both of these shows are amazing because what my wife and I really enjoy about them is when someone competing delivers an unexpected, outstanding performance or presentation. And they come up and when that person walks on stage, everyone, even us as an audience, think to ourselves, they ain't gonna make it. Anyone remember Susan Boyle? Right? They come on stage and you're like, oh, this is gonna be hilarious. And then they start singing and you're like, shut up, right? And that happens oftentimes on X Factor. It happens many times on Shark Tank. Someone comes with a business idea and you're like, wow, that's brilliant. Now, what my wife and I really particularly enjoy about these shows is when in the backstory prior to this person coming on stage or after they've presented their case, we find out that they apparently have spent most of their lives practicing and preparing for that moment. That's the kind of stuff I like. And I don't like to see somebody who's never done any work in their lives just get up and just make it. I love seeing them make it, and you find out, wait a minute, they've been practicing, they've been going to shows, they've been doing business ideas here and there, and they finally made it. Now, to the average viewer watching a show like that, when you see one of these stars get up there, you might think, wow, they came out of nowhere and shot right to the top of their field. But here's the core of tonight's message. Those who make the most of their big moments. Tonight's message is titled, Your Big Moment. Those who make the most of their big moments are rarely caught off guard when presented with the opportunity. We often talk about like, man, if I have my moment meant to shine, whatever your field is, we all have some vision, some dream that if I get my opportunity, I'm really going to show up. But here's what you should know. The people who make the most of those big moments are rarely caught off guard. Rather, they have taken every advantage of every experience in their lives as preparation for that day when they are presented with their big moment. So when you see somebody come on TV who looks like they can't sing and then they open their mouth and they can sing, or you see someone who looks like they should not succeed in this particular field and then they do, and you're like, wow, where'd that come from? You need to know they have spent most of their lives preparing for that moment. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. How you can prepare for your big moment. And your big moment is going to look different for everyone. For some of you, it might be in a sports field. For some of you guys, it might be in ministry. For some of you guys, it might be in business. For some of you guys, it might be in relationship. There is a big moment that inevitably comes in everyone's life where you will have an opportunity to put to use everything you've spent your life preparing for, or everything that God's planted in you. Well, tonight, as we enter back into Joe's story, we're going to see Joseph tonight experience his big breakout moment. And we'll learn from his story how to prepare for the day when God's going to present you with your big moment, how to shine and do something with what God has already planted in each and every one of you. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll make a case tonight that for each and every one of you in here tonight, and I'm not even just saying this to hype you up, for each and every one of you in here tonight, God has planted deep within you a holy passion that he wants to do something with. And I'll uncover that a little later on in the message. But for tonight, let's jump right into the passage. We are in Genesis chapter 41. If you don't know where that is, first book of the Bible. Easiest one to find, right? Look for chapter 41. And I'm just going to start by reading the first verse. Because it starts by saying, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Now, it's a very short verse. But man, this one verse is packed with a lot of content. In fact, it's packed. That one verse is packed with everything in chapter 40, the previous chapter, which I have conveniently chosen to skip because it's just depressing. And I feel like it's time to talk about some positive stuff, okay? Right? Joseph is in jail, right? We don't want to talk about that. We just got out of a hurricane, right? It's depressing. Anyway, if you were with us at the last time we met prior to this recent 3 weeks of Armageddon, we ended the last message in chapter 40 watching Joseph, the main character. If you remember that account, Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of trying to sleep with her, and Joseph was imprisoned, falsely imprisoned, right? In some Egyptian prison. Remember the story. God gave him a dream when he was a young boy. His brothers were jealous of him, sold him into slavery. He's yanked from his home in Canaan, taken to Egypt. He ends up in Potiphar's house. His wife accuses him falsely. He's thrown in jail. Well, while Joseph is in jail, while he's incarcerated, he meets two very high-ranking officials. This is chapter 40. I'm summarizing for you. While in jail, he meets two high-ranking officials who work closely with the king, and he does a huge favor for one of them by interpreting a disturbing dream this particular individual had. Unfortunately, after his release, this high-ranking official forgets about Joseph, forgets the favor Joseph does for him, and essentially abandons Joseph, leaving Joseph once again at rock bottom. Now, just so you know, in the chapter previous and in this chapter, we are told that God was with Joseph every step of the way. And God showed Joseph favor and God granted Joseph blessing, right? So we know God was with him. However, it's prison, all right? Nobody likes to hang out at prison, right? So things are rough for Joseph, right? When we get to the beginning of chapter 41 and it says 2 full years have passed, that means Joseph has been forgotten in prison for how long? 2 years. And there's reason to believe he was there longer because we're not exactly given a timeline of how long he'd been there. Yanked away from home, falsely accused, imprisoned for 2 years through no fault of his own. He's at rock bottom, separated from everything and everyone he's ever known. If you have a bad day, you should read this book. Joseph is a good acquaintance to have in pain because his story is powerful. Now, the good news, and why we've chosen to skip chapter 40, is because the tide is seriously about to turn in his life. And I love this chapter because the tide's seriously about to change in his life for better. And as we watch things unfold in Joseph's life, here's what I want to do tonight. I want to help you and I pick out some pointers from Joseph's life for how you can prepare for your big moment, right? When it's Sunday, a Sunday suddenly shows up at your doorstep. How do you prepare for that big moment, right? Because remember I've said, regardless of what field you're in, whatever it is God's called you, you will have a big moment, and your big moment will be an opportunity to put to practice, to put to good use, and experience success in whatever it is you've been called to. But remember what we've said tonight. Those who make the most of their big moment are rarely caught off guard. They use every experience that they go through in their lives to prepare for that moment. And tonight, hopefully, I'll give you some pointers on how to prepare for that moment. So let's quickly work through Joseph's story in Genesis chapter 41. If you're with me, you can follow along. I'm going to read a little later on, but let me just give you to set it up. So while Joseph is in prison, essentially forgotten, in Pharaoh's palace, the king Pharaoh, God gives Pharaoh a nightmare. This is fast. Let me just pause and say something about this. It says in that account that God gave Pharaoh a nightmare about events that soon happen in the country. And I was thinking about this, and it occurs to me that God works in the lives of Christian kings and non-Christian kings. And even for our current president, regardless of who you voted for, you need to understand that God works on a governmental level. There are spiritual activities that happen on a governmental level. All that to say, when did you pray last for the president? You know, I was blown away, and I'm going off topic here, so I apologize to my PowerPoint team. I was blown away by the last election, this last election, and how much division and just my news feed on Facebook. At some point, I didn't want to read it. It was so depressing to hear how much Christians were really going off on. I don't care who you vote for. But I thought to myself, I wonder if we spent more time praying for the president and his administration, perhaps we would experience what it is that we think we want. Anyway, I've gone off topic, but I just wanted to say that because I can. So Pharaoh has a nightmare. Pharaoh has a nightmare. Really one of the big points. Sometimes God will give presidents dreams about what's going to happen, and as a nation, we should be praying for him. Anyway, God gives Pharaoh a prophetic nightmare about events soon to happen. Pharaoh has this nightmare, and in his nightmare, here's what he sees. Pharaoh sees 7 scrawny, ugly cows eating up 7 healthy cows. But yet, after these scrawny cows eat these healthy cows, they still look scrawny. They haven't changed. Then he has another dream where he sees 7 healthy stalks of grain being swallowed up by 7 thin, withered stalks of grain. It's a strange dream. He can't figure it out. It disturbs him so much he can't go back to sleep. To make matters worse, his so-called magicians and counselor who interpret dreams have no idea what his dream means. And so Pharaoh's worried. The king of Pharaoh is worried. It's at that point that the guy that Joseph did a favor for in prison, who, by the way, has been released since then, remembers, oh, I know someone in prison who can interpret dreams. Tells the king this. Remember, this guy was a high-ranking official who served Pharaoh. He tells Pharaoh, I remember when I was in prison, there was this dude there who had the ability to interpret dreams. And so Joseph gets sent for. He gets sent for. He's cleaned up. He's shaved. He's giving new clothing. And here it is. Joseph gets his big breakout moment. This is his chance to make something of his life. This is good. Now, just so we're clear, in verse 16 of chapter 41, Joseph himself acknowledges that his ability to interpret dreams is not something he could just conjure up whenever he wants. Joseph makes the point that, listen, my ability to interpret dreams comes from God. It's a gift from God. I can't do this on my own. And so as a result of God's favor and God's presence in Joseph's life, Joseph comes before King Pharaoh. Joseph listens to this crazy, weird, strange dream the king has had. And he interprets it. He gives the accurate interpretation. He not only tells the king what the dream means, but I love this. He lays out a step-by-step plan of how the king is to run his kingdom over the next few years because of what the dream implies and how he can stay in power. Let me read to you what happens. It's a little extended. If you have your Bible, you might want to follow along. Genesis 41, starting in verse 25. It's 21 verses I want to read, but I want to read it because I think you need to hear the story. You need to put yourself in Egypt. You need to put yourself in the palace. You need to put yourself in Joseph's shoes as he's standing before King Pharaoh and he gets his big moment. This is his breakout moment. This is X Factor. You're about to sing. This is Shark Tank. You're about to present it. Here we go. Verse 25. Joseph responded to the king, "Sir, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing." Remember, he had 2 dreams. He tells him, he says, "Pharaoh, God is telling the Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity in Egypt." Verse 27. "The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. And this will happen just as I've described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do." This is Joseph speaking now. He's been speaking this whole time. Verse 29. "The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterwards there will be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will also be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen." Verse 33. "Therefore Pharaoh," this is Joseph telling Pharaoh counsel, "therefore Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it into Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away, guard it so that there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise the famine will destroy this land." Joseph's suggestion was well received by Pharaoh and his officials. And so Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, Joseph, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, this is the big moment, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly there is no one as intelligent or as wise as you are." I love this. Verse 40. "You, from henceforth, will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on the throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Verse 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariots reserved for the second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh. but no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. He also gave Joseph a wife whose name was Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. By the way, he was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. What a story, right? I mean, this story sounds like the American dream on steroids. Like, man, whoa, talk about blessing, right? By the way, anyone remember how old Joseph was when he was yanked away from his family? He was 17 years old. He spent the last 13 years being pushed around, dragged into prison, into slavery. But when he got his big moment, God made sure it paid off. Joseph didn't just get out of prison and get a promotion. He went from the penitentiary to the Pentagon. He went from Walmart to White House. And I didn't think of any more antithetical statements, but those are the two I came up with, right? So though God's hand was unmistakably present in Joseph's life, there's no doubt about that the reason why Joseph succeeded was because God's favor was upon his life. Though that is true, I can't help but feel like Joseph himself was always prepared for that moment. This wasn't Joseph just being in prison like, God's with me, okay, I have a chance to present before. I think Joseph was being prepared his whole life for this big moment. Now, there are questions that you and I want answered, right? Questions like, wait a minute, when exactly did Joseph receive all this interpretation, right? When did he get the time to think about such a detailed game plan to give to Pharaoh about Egypt? Did he receive it from God on the spot? Did God reveal it to him while he was in prison, while he was being dressed? When did Joseph get all this interpretation? For our purposes tonight, I'm going to assume that God had revealed this dream along with a solution long before Joseph ever came before Pharaoh. I'm going to propose that long before that moment, God had been planning in Joseph's mind not only the dream, but its interpretation, and had given him the opportunity to work it out. Keep in mind also that prior to that moment, Joseph has spent the last 13 years not just sitting on his hands, even in prison, but really getting practice. Let me give you two examples. For instance, in Genesis chapter 39, verse 20, when he was in prison, do you remember what it says in that account? It says that the favor of God was upon Joseph, so much so that the prison warden put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. So get this, in prison, at the darkest point in his life, he got some work experience. Put that on the resume. And by the way, remember we said last time we were here that this prison that Joseph is in is a white-collar prison. This is a prison reserved for the king's men, people who've offended the king. So he had a chance to learn, dare I say, some administrative skills while in prison, directing high-level ranking men. Prior to that, he was in Potiphar's house. And if you recall that account, it also says that Potiphar put him in charge of all his investments. And so Joseph had a chance to practice some of his financial skills. And though he was at the lowest point in his life in both of these situations, you could be certain that he was learning how to organize and how to plan. And all of that came in handy when he comes before the king. I think sometimes we look at these Bible stories and we think, oh, God was just with him and that's all that happened. And we forget that God oftentimes, though his favor is with us, God will oftentimes work through the natural skills and talents you've already been working on. Right? Let me give you an example. Spiritual gift of teaching. Most of you guys, a lot of you, girls and guys, have the spiritual gift of teaching. When you're giving the spiritual gift of teaching, you just don't automatically know how to teach. You got to put it to practice, and the Lord blesses it. Some of you guys have the gift of leadership. It's a spiritual gift, a unique thing where God has granted you the ability to lead. Like when you lead, people follow, and you don't know why. Here's the thing. You just don't know how to lead. You got to put it to practice, and God blesses it. Some of you guys are encouragers. I mean, let's be honest. There's some people who don't know how to encourage. You're telling them the problem, and they're like, yeah, you know what? I got the same problem, and they just forget you and tell you about themselves. And then God has blessed some of you with the ability to listen and speak. That comes through practice. Are you getting what I'm saying here? That though God's favor was with Joseph, he had practice in prison. He had practice in Potiphar's house so that when he had his big moment, boy was ready. So, here's time to fill out your notes. Let me give you 2 pointers, 2 big points. Actually, there's more than 2, but 2 pointers on how to prepare for your big moment. And boy, it's going to come. Some of you guys will experience this moment this year, next year, right? 2013, right? Some of you guys are going to expect it in the next few years, man. Here's how you prepare for your big moment. Number 1, here it is. Your holy burden, B-U-R-D, and it's up there. Your holy burdens will sometimes result in your greatest calling. Your holy burden will sometimes result in your greatest calling. You know, while you were answering that, think about these questions. What injustices or what unmet needs in the world bother you most deeply? I don't mean like that to just upset you, but I mean just you can't shake it off. There's an injustice in the world, in your community, wherever, that just bothers you deeply. Here's another one. What entrepreneurial ideas, what business ideas have been cooking in your mind for the longest time? And I don't mean like you have a great idea to make money real quick, but I mean this is just an idea that's you. Like you know every step of it. Like it's you. That's just your DNA. It just keeps coming and going in your life because what is that? Or here's another way to put it. What things have you witnessed and thought to yourself, we got to do something about this? Or what things have you witnessed and thought to yourself, we need a better version of that? Or you think to yourself, I think I know exactly how to fix that. How many of you guys have experienced a holy burden? By the way, these are what I call holy burdens. There are certain things that's just, man, it's you. It just eats away at you. And you're just thinking, man, if I had my opportunity, I think I would excel at this. By the way, it's those holy burdens that have led great men like Billy Graham and great women like Mother Teresa to abandon their way of life and really to go live with the poor and to start evangelistic crusades to reach so many people. In case that's too Christian for you, you should know it's the same burden that led men like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg to change their educational course and others to build a better computer and a software that gives users a better online experience. You listen to these men, they'll talk about just this burden. They're not satisfied with the status quo. They not only see things that are wrong, but they're led to want to do something about it. What is your holy burden? What bothers you deeply? Your greatest burden could result in your greatest calling. Let me put it this way. God has planted, and this is important, please get this part. God has planted in each one of you a vision, a burden that is going to be a solution to a problem somewhere in the world. It's a fascinating thought. There is a need right now, somewhere in the world, perhaps in your community, of which the solution is the idea that's been cooking in your mind and in your heart over the last few years. And every now and then you have days where you're like, I wish I could do this. I know there's something there, and you just don't know how to go about it. And God says, hey, I'm going to do something with that. Someone or some groups of people somewhere in the world are being stirred right now, just as Pharaoh was, whose needs will be met by the ideas God is stirring in you. Get this, the people who you're going to work with might not even be born yet. And God is saying it's still in gestation phase, right? I just still want you to kind of hone it, like make those, keep working on that. So then the question becomes, how are you fanning into flame the ideas and the holy burden that God is stirring in you? Is there something that really burns that you've been thinking to yourself, I wish I could do? I don't mean stuff like, like stuff that you've seen other people do to succeed. I mean things that's your personal desire, personal burden, a God-sent burden. Here's the deal. Here's how you fan it into flame. Even if there's no practical way you can put that to practice, might I encourage you to even just start writing it down? How many of you guys have ever written down how many of you guys journal? Okay. Maybe that's not for everyone, but I think it's incredibly helpful. Begin to write something down on paper. We live in a generation of external thinkers, so fine, start a blog. Call it My Plans to Rule the World, whatever, right? Just start journaling those thoughts down. What are some burdens God's been putting on your heart about a specific issue? Start writing those down. And here's the important part of that process. Commit your thoughts and your plans to God every step of the way. Commit your thoughts and plans every step of the way. I think I've shared this with you guys before. But did you know, and most of you guys know this, but remix was a term paper that I wrote in seminary before it became remix. For the longest time in seminary, I just kept feeling this burden to do a young adult ministry. I shared this before where I said, I found a journal of mine that I wrote in college, early on in college, and in my journal that I tracked down a few years later, like recently, it's like maybe 8, 9 years ago, I found one of the days where I journaled in there, I wrote there, I said, God, would you please raise up somebody at Grace Church to start a young adult ministry? This is when I was in college. And I've always joked about, man, I wished I'd asked for a car back then. It'd be awesome. A brand new Lexus or something, right? And this ministry was a paper that I wrote in college for a class. And I just wrote it. And about 9 months later, after I wrote it, the executive pastor approached me and said, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, you know what, I'd love to be in ministry. And I wrote this paper, and I'd like to start it. I'd love to kind of do this Sunday. I don't know. And he says, I'll give you $300, put together a plan, and come back and do something at Grace. And really, that's how this ministry started. And I don't say that to put me on the spot, but I say that to say, here's what's fascinating. Perhaps it's when you actually put a plan down that doors might begin to open. Is it possible that God is saying, why don't you put a plan on paper? Because I'm about to bring somebody in your life who's going to help you do something about it. But until you know, or you've given some framework to what I've put in you, you ain't going nowhere. Are you following me now when I'm telling you to journal things down? When a really good idea floods your mind, write it down. Pray to God every step of the way. Here it is. Pray that God would make it sticky. And by that I mean, let it catch on. Like, Lord, if this is you, don't let this go. Keep bringing this to my mind. Keep every time I see something that triggers it, let it keep coming back to my mind. That's the word. God, make it sticky. Ask God to clarify what it looks like. I love Proverbs chapter 16, verse 3. It's a good verse if you need a Bible passage. It says, if you need a memory verse, it says, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and read the rest with me, and your plans will succeed. Really? That's the best y'all can do? Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and what? Your plans will succeed. Your plans will succeed if you commit your plans to the Lord. All right, next one. Not only will your holy burden sometime result in your greatest calling, but gradually move your plans from theoretical to practical. Gradually move whatever burden that's just on your heart. You got to move from theoretical to practical. Here's what I know to be true about almost everyone. I've met people, and I know I've had in my... Everyone has great ideas of how everything can be done better. Everyone. If I came to you right now and I finished talking to you, I'm sure I would end up finding out that there's something that you think could be done better. But very few actually have a plan on how to make it happen. And even less people have actually attempted to do anything about it. For many of us, our plans are just theoretical. Never really put it out to practice. Let's go back to Joseph's story for a second. Could you picture Joseph going to Pharaoh after Pharaoh calls him up? Could you picture Joseph going to Pharaoh and saying, well, Pharaoh, here's what your dream means. You guys are going to have 7 bad years of good time, 7 years of good times, and 7 years of bad times. It's going to be really bad. All right, you guys want me to all die. So, I'll be praying for you guys, okay? So, awesome. Like, could you imagine if Joseph interpreted the dream and didn't give any recommendation? You know what I think would have happened? I think Pharaoh would have thanked him and probably sent him back, right to prison. I appreciate it. We'll lessen your term. You're going to do life? We'll give you 40. Okay, maybe 4 years. Okay. All right, because what good is he to him then? But through God's providence and through God's direct intervention, Joseph had a big picture plan. Dare I say, a detailed step-by-step plan with which to present to the king. And Pharaoh's cabinet was so impressed with him that what did they say? You know what they said to him? And please, I'm not bragging about it. I just got to use it to work. You know what they said to him? They said, I'll give you $300. Go do it. His cabinet was so impressed with him, they said, you have such a great plan. You've thought this through. You do it. And once again, I wonder if for many of you in here, those ideas that you have cooking, perhaps something would begin to happen if you actually wrote something down. You have some idea of how to, and you're not going to get everything. But perhaps God's waiting for you to say, hey, listen, why don't you kind of start putting this to practice? I put it in there. Now, here's the test to know if you're ready for your big moment. And this might not apply to everyone, but some of you it might. Especially those of you guys who might be in investment-related ideas. Here's a test to know if you're ready. If tomorrow morning a Christian, a wealthy Christian investor were to approach you, and this Christian investor shares the same passion, he has the same exact burdens you have. If he were to approach you and say, listen, I'm going to give you a $25,000 loan, but I'll give it to you on condition that you actually have a plan to carry out this thing we share. How many of you guys are ready to go tomorrow morning? I didn't hear the question, but it sounded funny.
Well, what's the interest rate?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I'm going to give it to you, and all I want is just for this to see this thing happen. I don't care about the interest. I don't want profit. I just want you to do this. Right? I mean, it's a wild scenario, right? Are you ready? The question at the heart of that illustration is, are you ready to follow through if your big moment showed up to help? Are you ready to follow through? Would you be able to lay out some form of a detailed plan? How would you use the funds to accomplish the goals? Or would you tell them to give you another 6 months so you can go think it through? Are you with me there? Okay, you can poke a lot of holes in that illustration. I'm just trying to make a point. In case you haven't caught on, that's why I'm encouraging you to write ideas down that deeply stir you. I would even take it a step further. I would recommend that you not just write your ideas down or your holy burdens down, but you put it into practice on a very small scale. Here's the illustration I like to use. Take it out of the mental garage for a test drive. Practice it on a very small scale. And once again, it's going to be different for each person, right? You have great dreams. Practice it on a very small scale. What kind of results would you see from that? Get this, it doesn't matter if you fail at it. If you fail at it, at least you'll know one way that it doesn't work, right? You'll need to adjust and tweak your plans as you go along. Educate yourself on, so what is your passion? Here's some insight. Educate yourself in that area. Learn all you need to learn. Is there anyone else doing what you're thinking about doing? How did they do it? What did they miss? What can I improve on? Research, learn everything and anything you know about it. Here's the deal. YouTube has a lot more educational videos than dumb people laughing at Double Rainbow, okay? There's stuff on there that could actually help you succeed. And you just got to know what you're looking for. There are people out there, and it's amazing. Anyway, there's stuff on YouTube that's very educational. So here's the deal. We're about to finish here. People who have found success in different fields of work have not always been the smartest. They haven't always been the most beautiful or even the most business-savvy people. People who've made the most of their big moment in their lives have been people who've spent their whole lives fine-tuning their passions and their holy burdens so that when their big moment arrived, they were prepared. They were prepared. And you as a follower of Jesus Christ not only have all of this at your advantage, but Scripture says you have the immeasurable power of the living God available to you. Can you imagine the impact that you would have on the world if you began doing something about your holy burden that God has planned on you? And the beauty of this, we got about, 30 people in here, 35, right? It's different for each one of you, and your passions can touch a different sphere of influence. Some of you might be in education. Some of you might be in business. Some of you might be in religion. Others might be in the teaching. Some of you might be in the service of the product, right? Do something about it. Start on a small scale. Your greatest burden can sometimes result in your greatest calling.